December 1943. A Canadian soldier crouches behind a pile of rubble, the air thick with dust and the smell of gunpowder. Through a hole in the wall, he can see German paratroopers moving through the building across the street. Not across the battlefield, across the street. So close he can hear them talking. This isn't war as most people imagine it. This is something entirely different. This is urban combat at its most brutal, most intimate, most terrifying. And for 26 days, Canadian forces fought through this medieval Italian town called Ortona in what would become one of the most savage battles of World War II. Room by room, house by house, wall by wall. The Germans called it Little Stalingrad. The Canadians just called it hell. So why haven't you heard about this? Why isn't the Battle of Ortona as famous as D-Day or the liberation of Paris? Well, that's part of what makes this story so fascinating and so tragic. While this battle raged, the world's attention was focused elsewhere. The newspapers barely covered it. The history books gave it a few paragraphs. But for the men who fought there, for the families who waited back home, and for the Italian civilians trapped in the crossfire, Ortona was everything. It was survival. It was sacrifice. It was one of the defining moments of Canada's role in the Second World War. The Italian campaign doesn't get the glory that other theaters of war receive, and that's a shame because what happened there was extraordinary. By late 1943, the Allies had already invaded Sicily and were pushing their way up the Italian peninsula. The goal was simple in theory: knock Italy out of the war, tie down German forces, and create a southern front that would relieve pressure on the Soviets in the east and eventually support the upcoming invasion of France. But simple in theory doesn't mean simple in execution. Italy's geography turned out to be a defender's paradise. Mountains, rivers, narrow valleys. The Germans under Field Marshal Albert Kesselring used every natural advantage to slow the Allied advance to a crawl. Enter the Canadians. The 1st Canadian Division had already proven itself in Sicily, fighting with skill and determination through some incredibly tough conditions. Now they were part of the 8th Army under British General Bernard Montgomery, and they were tasked with pushing up the Adriatic coast. Their objective was the port town of Ortona. Now you might be wondering, why Ortona? Why was this particular town so important? Well, it wasn't just about the town itself. It was about the road network. Ortona sat on Highway 16, the coastal road that could serve as a vital supply route. Control Ortona and you control access to the central Italian heartland. Plus, taking Ortona would allow the Allies to bring supplies through its port, which was crucial for sustaining the advance. But there was something else at play here, something more political than strategic. Montgomery wanted a victory. He wanted a headline. The campaign in Italy had been grinding and brutal, with little to show for it except casualties and exhausted troops. Taking Ortona before Christmas would be a morale booster, a symbolic win that could capture public attention. So the order came down: take Ortona. The Canadians advancing on Ortona were primarily from the 1st Canadian Infantry Division, and more specifically, it would be the men of the loyal Edmonton Regiment and the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada who would bear the brunt of the fighting. These weren't hardened career soldiers. Most of them were young men from farms and cities across Canada who had volunteered to fight fascism. They'd been trained, sure, but nothing really prepares you for what they were about to face. Now let's talk about their enemy. Defending Ortona were the German 1st Parachute Division, elite Fallschirmjäger troops. These weren't regular Wehrmacht soldiers. Paratroopers in the German military were considered among the absolute best. They were fanatically loyal, superbly trained, and experienced in brutal close-quarters combat. Their commander in the sector understood the value of Ortona too, but for different reasons. For the Germans, every day they held Ortona was another day the Allied advance was stalled. Every Canadian soldier tied up fighting in Ortona was one less soldier pushing toward Rome. The order from German high command was clear: make them pay for every inch. The approach to Ortona was already a nightmare. The terrain around the town was crisscrossed with ravines, gullies, and ridges. The Germans had turned every farmhouse into a fortress, every hedgerow into a killing zone. Canadian troops had to fight through a series of defensive lines, taking horrific casualties just to get within sight of the town. The weather was miserable. Cold, wet, muddy. December in coastal Italy isn't the Mediterranean paradise you might imagine. It was cold enough to be miserable but not cold enough to freeze the mud, so everything was just slippery, sticky, exhausting. By mid-December, the Canadians had fought their way to the outskirts of Ortona. They'd crossed the Moro River in a brutal engagement that cost hundreds of lives. They'd taken a strategic position called Casa Berardi, where a Canadian officer named Paul Trique earned the Victoria Cross for leading his company through withering fire to capture a German strongpoint. And now they stood at the edge of Ortona itself, looking at a medieval town built on a cliff overlooking the Adriatic Sea. Narrow streets. Stone buildings packed tight together. It looked like something from a postcard, but it was about to become a graveyard. On December 20th, the Canadians entered Ortona. Almost immediately, they realized this was going to be unlike anything they'd experienced before. The Germans had evacuated most of the Italian civilians, which should have been a relief, but it also meant one thing: anyone still in the town was enemy. The streets were too narrow for tanks to maneuver effectively. Artillery support risked bringing buildings down on your own troops. This was going to be infantry work. Personal, close, deadly. The Germans had prepared Ortona brilliantly. They'd mined the streets and booby-trapped the rubble. They'd set up machine gun positions covering every approach. They'd demolished buildings to create roadblocks and positioned snipers in church towers and upper floors. But their most effective tactic was something the Canadians hadn't anticipated. The Germans would let Canadian troops enter a building, then blow holes through the walls and attack from adjacent buildings. You'd clear a house, think you were safe, and suddenly the wall would explode and enemy soldiers would pour through. So the Canadians adapted. This is where the story gets really interesting because it shows the ingenuity and determination of these soldiers under impossible conditions. A Canadian officer, we're not entirely sure who first came up with it, but the technique became known as mouse holing. Since moving through the streets was suicidal, the Canadians decided to move through the buildings instead. They'd use explosives to blow holes in the walls between houses, creating their own internal network of passages. They'd advance from house to house without ever stepping outside. It was like creating their own maze through the town, moving like mice through walls. But mouse holing was slow, dangerous work. You'd blow a hole in the wall, toss in grenades, then rush through not knowing what was on the other side. Sometimes it was an empty room. Sometimes it was a prepared German position. The fighting was face-to-face, often hand-to-hand. Grenades bounced off walls and came back at you. Rifle fire in enclosed spaces was deafening. The dust and smoke made it hard to see, and you never knew if the floor above you or below you held enemy soldiers waiting to attack. One Canadian sergeant described it this way. He said you'd hear Germans on the other side of the wall. Sometimes you could hear them breathing. You'd know they knew you were there. Then it was a question of who would strike first. Do you blow the wall and charge? Do you wait for them to try it? The psychological strain was immense. Every moment was tension. Every sound could be death approaching. The battle developed into a kind of horrible routine. Advance, blow a hole, clear a room, move to the next wall. Repeat. Hours would pass taking a single building. Days would pass taking a city block. The close quarters meant that traditional military advantages didn't matter as much. A private with a submachine gun was just as valuable as a major. Rank mattered less than reflexes and courage. Christmas came while the battle raged. Can you imagine that? Young Canadian soldiers, thousands of miles from home, spending Christmas fighting room to room through a destroyed Italian town. Some units managed brief pauses to share rations and sing carols quietly. Others were too engaged in combat to even mark the day. There was no peace on earth, not here, not now. Just the constant crack of gunfire and the crump of explosions echoing through medieval streets. The town square, the Piazza Municipale, became a particularly contested area. The Germans had fortified the buildings around it, turning them into interconnected strongpoints. Taking the square would split the German defenses, so it became crucial. The fighting there was absolutely ferocious. Buildings changed hands multiple times. The Canadians would take a position in the morning, lose it by afternoon, and fight to retake it by evening. Bodies piled up in the rubble. The destruction was total. Artillery and tank fire had reduced much of Ortona to ruins. But still, the Germans held on, and still, the Canadians pushed forward. One of the most dramatic moments came at the church of Santa Maria di Costantinopoli. The Germans were using the church and surrounding buildings as a major defensive position. The Canadians needed to take it, but the approach was covered by multiple machine guns, and the thick stone walls made it nearly impregnable. A small group of Canadian soldiers managed to work their way through adjacent buildings, mouse-holing their way closer. They planted explosives against the church wall, withdrew, and detonated them. The blast created a massive hole. Canadian soldiers poured through, engaging German paratroopers in close combat among the pews and rubble. It took hours to clear the church, and the cost in lives was terrible, but eventually the position fell. Now here's something that really drives home the surreal horror of this battle. In some buildings, Canadian troops would be fighting Germans on the ground floor, while Italian civilians were still huddled in the cellars below, trapped and terrified. The Canadians did what they could to protect civilians, but in the chaos of combat, it was nearly impossible to ensure their safety. Some estimates suggest around 1,300 Italian civilians died during the battle, caught between two armies tearing their town apart. As the days wore on, both sides were exhausted. The Germans had taken heavy casualties. Their elite paratroopers were being ground down in a battle of attrition that favored no one. The Canadians were equally battered. Companies that had entered Ortona with over 100 men were down to 40 or 50 effectives. Everyone was running on adrenaline and determination because there was nothing left in the tank. Sleep was impossible. Food was whatever you could grab. Water was scarce. And always, there was the fear that the next wall you blew through would be your last. But slowly, inexorably, the Canadians gained ground. Block by block, building by building, they pushed the Germans back toward the eastern edge of town. The German command realized that Ortona had served its purpose. They delayed the Allied advance, inflicted serious casualties, and tied down Canadian forces for weeks. On December 27th, the German paratroopers began a fighting withdrawal. They didn't give up. They made the Canadians pay for every final yard. But by December 28th, Ortona was finally in Canadian hands. The cost was staggering. The Canadians suffered over 2,300 casualties in the battle for Ortona and the approaches to it. Nearly 500 men were killed. The loyal Edmonton Regiment and the Seaforth Highlanders were particularly hard hit, having done most of the house-to-house fighting. German casualties are harder to pin down, but estimates suggest they lost at least as many, possibly more. For a town that most people had never heard of, the butcher's bill was horrific. And here's the thing that makes this story even more poignant. The strategic value of Ortona was questionable from the start. By the time the Canadians took the town, the broader Italian campaign had already shifted. The port wasn't used as extensively as planned. The road network, while useful, wasn't the game changer some had hoped. Montgomery got his headline, his Christmas victory, but at what cost? Some military historians argue that Ortona didn't need to be taken at all, or at least not taken in the manner it was, with such brutal frontal urban combat. But for the soldiers who fought there, questions of strategic value were irrelevant. They'd been given a mission, and they'd accomplished it with incredible bravery and sacrifice. The techniques they developed in Ortona, particularly the mouse-holing method of urban warfare, were studied and adopted by armies around the world. The lessons learned in those medieval streets would inform urban combat tactics for decades to come. Modern military urban warfare doctrine owes a debt to what happened in Ortona. The Italian civilians who survived the battle returned to find their town virtually destroyed. Over 70% of the buildings were damaged or demolished. The infrastructure was gone, and mixed in with the rubble were unexploded ordnance, booby traps, and the bodies of soldiers still buried in collapsed buildings. It would take years to rebuild. The relationship between Ortona and Canada, however, became something special. The town never forgot the Canadian soldiers who liberated them at such cost. To this day, Ortona maintains strong ties with Canada. Streets are named after Canadian regiments. Memorials honor the fallen. Every December, ceremonies are held to remember the battle. Back in Canada, the reaction to Ortona was complex. There was pride in the victory, certainly, but also grief for the losses and questions about why this battle wasn't receiving more attention. Some newspapers covered it, but it was overshadowed by other events. The Pacific War, the build-up to D-Day, even Christmas celebrations back home pushed Ortona off the front pages. Canadian veterans of the battle would later express frustration that their sacrifices seemed forgotten compared to other more famous engagements. One veteran, years later, described coming home after the war and trying to tell people about Ortona. He said most Canadians had never heard of it. They knew about Dieppe, they knew about the eventual push into France, but Ortona, it was like it never happened. That sense of being forgotten, of having fought through hell for something that didn't seem to matter to the folks back home, that stayed with many of the survivors. The parallels to Stalingrad are striking, even if the scale was different. Stalingrad was a massive city, a battle involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers over many months. Ortona was a small town, thousands of soldiers, just over a week of intense urban combat. But the nature of the fighting was remarkably similar. The close quarters brutality, the destruction of the urban landscape, the determination of both sides to hold or take the position regardless of cost. The German paratroopers who fought at Ortona and had veterans from the Eastern Front among their ranks reportedly commented on the similarities, hence the nickname, Little Stalingrad. What's fascinating is how the Battle of Ortona has been remembered differently in different places. In Germany, it's barely remembered at all, just another delaying action in a campaign they eventually lost. In Britain, it's a footnote in the Italian campaign, overshadowed by Monte Cassino and other battles. In Italy, particularly in Ortona itself, it's remembered vividly as the liberation of their town at tremendous cost. And in Canada, there's been a growing recognition over the decades that Ortona represents something important about the Canadian military experience in World War II. Because here's what Ortona really shows. It shows that Canadian soldiers could fight and win against elite enemy troops in the worst possible conditions. It shows innovation and adaptability, the development of new tactics in the heat of combat. It shows sacrifice and determination. And maybe most importantly, it shows that not all heroism happens in famous battles that make the history books. Sometimes the hardest fighting, the most incredible bravery, happens in places nobody's heard of, for objectives that might not even matter in the grand scheme of things, but matter absolutely to the people fighting for them. The survivors of Ortona carried those memories for the rest of their lives. In interviews conducted decades later, elderly veterans would describe specific moments with crystal clarity. The sound of a grenade bouncing off a wall, the face of a friend who didn't make it, the taste of dust in their mouths, the cold, the fear, but also the bonds formed with their fellow soldiers, bonds that came from shared survival of something unimaginable. Many of them returned to Ortona in their later years, making pilgrimages back to the streets where they'd fought as young men. The Italian people would welcome them as heroes, which many of them found overwhelming because they didn't think of themselves as heroes, just as soldiers who did their job. There's a memorial in Ortona now, the Morrow River Canadian War Cemetery, where many of the Canadian soldiers who died in the battle are buried. It's a peaceful place, white headstones in neat rows overlooking the landscape they fought through. Each headstone tells a story. Private, age 22. Sergeant, age 25. So many of them were so young. Walking through that cemetery, you're struck by the sheer number of them, and by the fact that for every name on a headstone, there were families back in Canada who received telegrams, who had their worlds shattered, who lost sons and brothers and husbands in a town they'd never heard of on the other side of the world. The Italian campaign as a whole has often been called the Forgotten Front, and Ortona exemplifies why that's such a tragedy. While the campaign didn't achieve all its strategic objectives as quickly as hoped, it did tie down significant German forces that could have been used elsewhere. It knocked Italy out of the war, and it provided crucial experience for Allied forces in combined operations, urban warfare, and amphibious assaults that would prove invaluable in France and beyond. The soldiers who fought there deserved better than to be forgotten, and battles like Ortona deserve to be remembered alongside the more famous engagements of the war. There's been a push in recent years to give Ortona its proper place in Canadian history. Documentaries have been made, books have been written, school curricula have started including it. Veterans organizations have worked to ensure that the story is passed down to new generations, because it matters. It matters that we remember not just the big, famous battles, but all of them. It matters that we honor the sacrifice of soldiers who fought in places that didn't make headlines. It matters that we understand the full scope of what was asked of that generation and what they gave. Standing in Ortona today, you can still see evidence of the battle. Buildings with walls patched over where Canadian soldiers blew holes, plaques marking where fierce fighting occurred. The Church of Santa Maria, rebuilt but bearing the scars of war. The narrow streets that were killing zones. And if you walk through town with someone who knows the history, they can point out the path the Canadians took, building by building, the slow, agonizing advance through the medieval quarter. It's haunting. This picturesque Italian coastal town was once the scene of one of the war's most brutal battles, and the ghosts of that battle linger. So why does Ortona matter? Why should you care about this battle you probably never heard of before? Because it's a perfect example of the complexity and tragedy of war. It shows that bravery and sacrifice happen in obscure places for questionable objectives. It shows that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. It shows the cost of war not just in strategic terms, but in human terms. Every one of those 2,300 Canadian casualties was a person. Every German paratrooper killed was someone's son. Every Italian civilian who died was a human being whose only crime was living in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Battle of Ortona teaches us that war is not glorious, even when it's necessary. It's brutal and destructive and traumatic for everyone involved. The Canadian soldiers who fought there came home changed, many of them carrying physical and psychological wounds that never fully healed. Some thrived despite their experiences. Others struggled with what we'd now call PTSD for the rest of their lives. The Italian town took years to rebuild and decades to fully recover economically. War leaves scars that last generations. But Ortona also teaches us about resilience and remembrance. The town rebuilt, the survivors moved forward with their lives, and the connection between Ortona and Canada, forged in those terrible December days in 1943, endured and even strengthened over time. The Italian people didn't forget their liberators, and increasingly, Canadians are learning about and honoring the sacrifice made in that distant town. There's something beautiful in that, even amidst all the tragedy. Human beings have an incredible capacity to find meaning and connection, even in the worst circumstances. The veterans are almost all gone now. The last survivors of the Battle of Ortona have passed into history, but their story lives on in the memories they left behind, in the records they kept, in the interviews they gave. And it lives on in places like Ortona itself, where the debt owed to those Canadian soldiers is still acknowledged and honored. On December 28th every year, the anniversary of Ortona's liberation, ceremonies are held. Canadian flags fly alongside Italian flags. And for a moment, the world remembers what happened there 8 decades ago. This is the story of the Battle of Ortona, Canada's Stalingrad, one of the most brutal urban battles of World War II and one of the most overlooked. It's a story of young men far from home fighting through hell for objectives they probably didn't fully understand, showing courage and innovation and determination in the face of horror. It's a story of loss and sacrifice, of friendships forged in combat, of a town destroyed and rebuilt. And it's a story that reminds us that history is full of these moments, these places, these battles that shaped lives and tested souls even if they didn't make the front pages. Every soldier who fought at Ortona has a story. Every building in that town witnessed something profound. And every December 28th, we have an opportunity to remember them all, to honor their service, and to ensure that their sacrifice is never truly forgotten. The Battle of Ortona matters not because it changed the course of the war, but because it changed the lives of everyone who experienced it, and because their courage in the face of such adversity deserves to be remembered and honored for all time.